Let's now keep promisifying things, and this time around we're gonna promisify the geolocation API. And this is gonna be really cool because it will allow us to take the small app that we built in the last coding challenge to the next level. Now, we used the geolocation API before, and so let's start by reviewing how it works. So remember, we use navigator.geolocation.get current position. And then this function here accepts two callbacks, where the first is for the success and the second one is for the error. So this first callback function actually gets access to the position object. So let's pass that in as an argument to this callback function. And then let's simply log that to the console. So this is our first callback. And now let's create the second callback with the error. So for example, in case that the user does not allow the page to get access to the current location. And so in that case, let's just log that error to the console, just as we did previously. And so now, just like before, in the map the app, JavaScript asks us for permission here. And when we allow, then at some point when JavaScript actually figures out the location, then we get that data back. And so here it is. And so again, this is actually asynchronous behavior in exactly the way that we have been talking about. So the code is not blocked, which we can check here. So we have a console.log after the geolocation part here, and still this part here is logged first, and so this one happens first. And so that's because this function here basically offloaded its work to the background, so to the web API environment in the browser, and then immediately it moved on right here to the next line, right? So this is very clearly a callback-based API, right? So we have to pass in these different callbacks. And so this is another great opportunity to promisify a callback-based API to a promise-based API. So let's do that. And it's actually pretty simple. So let's create a function here, just like before with the wait function. So get position, and we don't need to pass anything into this one. And just like before, we are going to return a new promise, which we then can handle later on. So here we pass in the executor function, which gets access to the resolve function and the reject function, which remember we can use to mark the promise as either rejected or fulfilled. All right. So let's actually grab this code here and paste it here. And now all we need to change is basically what happens here in each of these callback functions. So remember that this one here is the success callback function. And so it receives the position. And so when we have success, we want to resolve the promise, right? So we want to mark it as fulfilled. And so therefore we call the resolve function and we pass in that position object, because that is actually the fulfilled value that we want to get from this promise in case that it is successful, right? So that's the whole reason of using this function in the first place. It is to get access to the current position, and that is in this object. And so therefore, that's what we're going to pass into resolve, right? So in the last lecture, we just passed a simple string into resolve because that would then be the resolved value of the promise. So basically the future value of the promise. But in this case, it is this more meaningful object which we actually need outside of the promise here when we handle it. But anyway, here we do the same, but with reject. And so this is going to work just fine. But we can actually make this even simpler, because if this function here automatically calls these callback functions here, and if it also automatically passes in the position, then we can simply do this. So let's copy it here, and I will comment this part. So we can simply do this. Resolve and reject. And that's it. So this is exactly the same as this one here. So before we specified the callback manually like this, but all we did was to take the position and pass it then into resolve. But here, that now happens automatically. So now resolve itself is the callback function, which will get called with the position, right? And so that's exactly what we do here, okay? And the same, of course, here with reject. And so now, let's actually try this out. So, get position, and then we want to handle the result. So again, this is exactly the same thing that we did previously with the fetch function, right? Or also with the wait function that we created in the last lecture. So let's now log this position to the console. And for now, we don't need the catch block. And so let's see. So it probably is now getting the position in the background. And yeah, so now we got it back. So the promise was marked as successful by the resolve function. And so therefore, then here, this callback was called in the then handler. And so the position was passed in. And here, finally, we logged it to the console. So beautiful. This worked just fine. And so we just promisified the geolocation API to a promise-based API now. But now let's actually take it to the next level. So remember how in the last coding challenge, we built a function which received GPS coordinates as an input and then rendered the corresponding country. Well, now we actually got these coordinates via geolocation, and so we don't even have to pass in any coordinates into that function. So let me actually get that function from the coding challenge. So that's this one here. And so remember, here we passed in the latitude and longitude, and then based on that, we did reverse geocoding, which gave us the country that basically these coordinates belong to. And so then, based on that country, we could get all the data about the country and then display it here on our page. But now, since we have this getPosition function, we actually no longer need to even pass in these coordinates. And so now we're going to be able to build a function that will tell us where we are in the world simply based on the geolocation of our device. So how cool is that? So we no longer need this one. And now here, this time, we are going to start by getting the position. So get position. And then let's do something with the position. So we already know that the coordinates are here in this coords property. I just don't remember if they are an array or an object. So let's log that to the console here for starters. So console.log position.coords. All right. And so for now, we'll just leave it at that. And we will not yet connect it to this part here. Okay. So let's run this, but probably we're going to get an error when we run this. Oh, and actually we first need to set it up with the event handler. So remember, that's the button. And then add event listener. And of course, we could also immediately run the function, but I think that it's nice to call it only when we click that button. And here we actually can simply pass in that function now. So the where am I function, because we don't need to pass in any arguments. So if we click now, yeah, so here then we get an error that latitude is not defined, but what we were interested in anyway is here the latitude and the longitude of this coords object. And so let's now go ahead and destructure this object. So const latitude and longitude equals this. But now here we call them lat and lng, and so let's do this. So basically giving them new names. And next, all we need to do then is to chain the next promise. And so let's grab this code here and put it in here. And so just like before, we now simply create a new promise here, basically, and then return that. And so then we can handle it here in the next then handler. Okay? And so now we have an even longer chain, as you can see. This one here still comes from here. No need for that anymore. And so now let's see what happens. So latitude is not defined, but that's because I got this syntax here wrong. So in destructuring, the equal sign is actually to set a default value. So this is not what we want. We want to still destruct latitude, and then we want to say that we basically want to create a variable called lat. So based on that latitude variable. And here lng to fit this one and this one, right? So let's try again. And so this takes some time. So in the real world, we would have like some loading spinner, but it works, right? So we got now the country that I'm currently in, which is indeed Portugal. And all of that was simply done using geolocation. So again, we got the coordinates here. Then from those coordinates, we got the location. So the actual location with country. And so then from there, we got all the data about the country. And so now we have the ability of basically displaying the flag of a country simply based on geolocation on any device. Now just imagine that you would have to handle all of these asynchronous operations here using callback function. So that would like literally be hell. So therefore the name callback hell. But again, with this, we have a really nice flat chain of promises that's easy to handle and also easy to manage. All right. But anyway, with this, we saw that we can really promisify all kinds of asynchronous stuff in JavaScript. For example, we could also promisify the old XML HTTP request function that we used in the beginning to make AJAX calls. Or also, we could promisify the image loading example that we have seen a couple of times in our slides. And actually, that's exactly what we're going to do in the next coding challenge.